Good afternoon and welcome to the 214th of the COVID calls. This is a daily discussion of the COVID-19 pandemic with a diverse collection of disaster experts. My name is Scott Gabriel Knowles. Today is the first of three COVID calls special episodes in partnership with two great research libraries, the American Philosophical Society and the Linda Hall Library. These three episodes will explore challenges and changes for research libraries and the scholars that use them in the time of COVID. We will be especially interested in these episodes to think about the ways that library and archival materials in the history of science, technology, and medicine can teach us about COVID-19. Just a reminder, you can catch COVID Calls live every weekday at 5 p.m. Eastern Time on YouTube. Just go to the COVID Calls YouTube channel to watch. You can also watch COVID Calls on Facebook Live and on Periscope. You can hear COVID Calls anytime recorded as podcasts on Spotify, iTunes, Podbean, or anywhere you get podcasts. You can also keep up with COVID Calls via Twitter using the handle @US of Disaster or @COVID Calls. Please do help spread the word and send suggestions for future guests and future topics. Please feel free to suggest yourself as a future guest. As of today, February 3rd, 2021, there are 2,259,391 deaths globally from COVID-19, according to the Johns Hopkins University Coronavirus Resource Center. There are 447,852 deaths reported in the United States. That's up from 444,123 reported yesterday. As a way to bring some humanity to the numbers, I've been reading a life story or a story of advocacy for those impacted by the pandemic in some way, and I'd like to continue that now. Headline is, his life hadn't even started. Texas 9-year-old J.J. Boatman passes away from COVID-19 complications. This was written by Carolyn Vandergriff, published January 26, 2021, with CBS Local, Dallas-Fort Worth, Texas, Dateline Fort Worth, Texas. A Texas family is grieving the unexpected loss of their 9-year-old son, who they say died of complications related to COVID-19. J.J. Boatman of Vernon passed away at Cook Children's Medical Center in Fort Worth on Tuesday, January 26th. He was a loving, caring little boy, said his uncle Gabriel Ayala. Like every time he would see you or any family member, he'd run up and hug you. Just a few weeks ago, JJ celebrated his 9th birthday with tacos and cake. We never knew this was going to be his last birthday, Ayala said. The little boy had asthma, but Ayala said it didn't stop him from being active and playing with his cousins or older sisters. He was just running around and playing earlier that day, and by the nighttime, he was yelling and crying to his mom that he couldn't breathe, said Ayala. His mom went over and his face was blue already and his lips were blue. Ayala says JJ was taken on a medical helicopter from Vernon, where his family lives, to Cook Children's Medical Center. By the time he arrived, his lungs were filled with fluid. Ayala said the doctors told JJ's mom he died from complications related to COVID-19. She didn't know that she was going to come home empty-handed without her son, he said. That was her baby son. That was her only son. Ayala says it shows anyone can get the virus, and he hopes people continue to take the threat seriously as his family grieves for the little boy whose life was cut short. We're going to miss him his whole life, Ayala said. He's going to miss his whole life. His life hadn't even started. Wednesday, January 27th, CBS 11 spoke with JJ's father, Jason Boatman. Don't know how to live life anymore because everything's just literally changed. Everything has literally just changed when your baby boy is not ever coming back. Sunday night, he was as happy, hyper, easygoing self, JJ's dad said. I woke up that next morning to go to work. I could hear him wheezing a little bit, but he's had croup before, so I thought it was croup. Boatman said in addition to asthma, his son had autism and ADHD, but he said was otherwise active and healthy. Not long after getting to work, his wife told him their son woke up screaming, saying he couldn't breathe. She rushed him to the ER. They had done x-rays, and they say your lungs are supposed to be black when you do x-rays, but his were completely white, he said. JJ was flown from Vernon to Cook Children's in Fort Worth, and that's where the family found out he was positive for COVID-19. The next morning, the little boy's heart gave out. The hardest part was coming home and putting the key in the door and you open the front door, you're reminded of him everywhere, said his father. Try to really appreciate what you have. I mean, I know everybody does, but really take it to heart because it can be taken away within 7 to 8 hours, like mine was. The family has set up a GoFundMe account to help pay for JJ's funeral. This obituary was featured on the Twitter account Faces of COVID. Okay, I'm going to turn to my conversation today. And the first thing I'd like to do is introduce my friend Adriana Link, who came up with the idea and did the organizing work for these 3 special COVID Calls episodes. Adriana Link is the head of scholarly programs at the American Philosophical Society. She received her PhD from the Department of History of Science and Technology at the Johns Hopkins University in 2016, where she specialized in the history of 20th century American anthropology. And she's currently preparing a book manuscript on the history of urgent anthropology at the Smithsonian Institution. Adriana, it's great to see you.
Thanks so much, Scott. It's lovely to be here, and I'm glad that this program has finally come to fruition after much planning.
We've been talking about it a long time. I was starting to think it was one of those projects you work on where the fun is the talking about, I say fun advisedly in the COVID context, but we've had some great discussions about putting this together. I'm glad we're finally able to do it.
Likewise, and good to do it with a fellow Hopkins graduate. I just wanted to say a couple words before we turn it over to our discussants about some of the thinking behind this curated series of discussions. And I wanted to say that, while we'll be talking about the history of science collections and featuring perspectives from researchers, from former fellows, and also library directors, I wanted to think about this opportunity not just to reflect on the impact of COVID on libraries and archives, but also to think about what libraries and archives can teach us about COVID-19, and especially related to questions of access, of archival practices, and the way that these repositories might serve different audiences, both now and as we continue to think about these questions in the future. So I couldn't think of a better way to start this series of conversations than by hearing from the heads of 2 institutions that have really robust holdings in the history of science, technology, and medicine. And those institutions are, of course, Linda Hall Library and my own institution, the American Philosophical Society. So I'm especially grateful that Linda Hall's president, Lisa Brower, and Patrick Spiro, the librarian and director of the Library and Museum at the APS, could be here today and could get us started in facilitating this discussion. And I hope to continue the themes started today with tomorrow's conversation, which will feature Robin Wolf-Scheffler and Joanna Radin talking about their experiences researching both at the APS and at Linda Hall, and their work on the history of biomedicine and biotech. And then to wrap things up, we'll be talking with 2 APS fellows who have the unfortunate luck of finishing up their dissertations about healthcare during the pandemic. So join us on Friday with Nicole Schroeder and Andrew Seaton. If you haven't already done so, I encourage you to check out the APS's website to learn more about this series and about our upcoming programming, as well as to learn how to connect with our collections. And our website address is www.amphilsoc.org. And with that, I'll turn it over to Scott, Lisa, and Patrick.
Okay, Adriana, thank you for that. And tomorrow, I hope you'll come out at the beginning. We can chat a few minutes before the talk with Robin and with Joanna tomorrow. It'll be great to catch up with you then. Okay, thanks. Okay, let me introduce my guests for the conversation today. Lisa Brower was appointed president of the Linda Hall Library of Science, Engineering, and Technology in July 2008. And prior to accepting this position, she was university librarian at the New School in New York City from 2002 until 2008. Lisa previously served as the Brooke Russell Astor Chief Librarian for Rare Books and Manuscripts at the New York Public Library. In 1996, Lisa was named the 3rd director of the Lilly Library at Indiana University in Bloomington and the first woman to fill this position. And she served as the Lilly librarian for 6 years until 2002. She's currently the chair of the Independent Research Libraries Association. My second guest is Patrick Spero. He's a librarian of the American Philosophical Society and a historian of early American history who specializes in the era of the American Revolution. He's the author of Frontier Rebels, The Fight for Independence in the American West, 1765 to 1776, which appeared with Norton in 2018, and Frontier Country, The Politics of War in Early Pennsylvania, which appeared with Penn Press in 2016. He's also the one of the editors of the edited anthology, The American Revolution Reborn, New Perspectives for the 21st Century, which also appeared with Penn in 2016. Prior to his appointment at the American Philosophical Society, Dr. Spero taught at Williams College, and he received his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania in 2009. Lisa Brower and Patrick Spero, thank you so much for joining me on COVID Calls today.
Thank you, Scott.
Good to be here.
I'd like to start the way I usually do, just to find out where you're calling in from and what the pandemic situation is there today. Lisa, let me start with you.
Well, at the moment, I'm in my home in Leawood, Kansas, which is a suburb of greater metropolitan Kansas City, Missouri. The situation here is we are pulling out of the third wave. We were in quite a bit of a spike after the holiday season. And that was really the third wave of infection. And the infection rate here, probably per capita, rivaled anything in larger metropolitan areas. So that was very troubling. But things are getting better. The incidence of hospitalizations is beginning to go down, as is the incidence of new infections reported every day. So things are looking up. The big concern now is, as it is everywhere, a shortage of vaccine. A demand that far outstrips the supply of vaccine that's been allocated to us.
Do you have a handle on that? Any sort of a sense of how the state is prioritizing who gets that vaccine?
Well, Missouri has its own priorities. Kansas has its own priorities. And where I live in Kansas, they put out a notice that anybody over 65 can get a vaccine, but don't call us, we'll call you. And so right now they're vaccinating, after they took care of the first responders and medical personnel, which was absolutely the first wave, they're vaccinating people 80 and above, if you can get an appointment. Because again, and I was just reading about this in the New York Times about the problems the elderly are having getting online, getting appointments, getting up in the middle of the night to try to, not get kicked out of a website. So those problems are here on a somewhat smaller scale. But we're doing what we can, and every doctor keeps saying, just pack your patience. We will get to you eventually. You just have to be patient. And in the meantime, practice the best preventative measures that have been prescribed.
Patrick, where are you located right now, and what's the situation there?
I'm coming to you from Library Hall at the American Philosophical Society, just off Independence National Historic Park. We're a few feet from Independence Hall, where the Declaration was signed, the Constitution written. So I'm in Philadelphia, Scott, and you're a disaster historian with a foot in Philadelphia. So in some ways, I think you probably know how the situation's going in Philadelphia better than me. But from everything that I've read, it's pretty close to being a disaster right now in terms of vaccine rollout. Like Lisa, the numbers seem to be at least plateauing and going down. I think we've probably all seen that that's a national trend going on. And I know I read in the New York Times this weekend that there's a lot of speculation on why that may be. But I think that's a sign of good news. But here in Philadelphia, the vaccine rollout has been very rough. There was some missteps by the city government and their partner that the city is now trying to rectify so that we can start getting vaccines out. And Scott, I think you probably know a lot more about the details on that than me, but that's the gist.
Yeah, that's a story we're gonna be hearing a lot more about, I think, in the weeks to come. And this disaster has had so many different acts to it, and now all of our conversation is taken up with vaccine and the discussion of the vaccine and vaccination. But one of the reasons I was really excited to talk with both of you is that the institutions that you run have really had to adapt to every phase of this pandemic. And I think sometimes we forget how many phases we've been through, becoming aware of it, the closing down of institutions, the possibility for new openings, reopening in the summer and through the fall, and then what we're facing now. So you've got kind of the big the big view of it from your institutional perspective. And I want to dive into all of that. But before we start, I kind of wanted to give you a chance to give listeners and viewers a sense of your institution that you direct. People have heard of Linda Hall Library, if they've heard of the American Philosophical Society, maybe they've never had a chance to do any research there. Tell us, if you would, and Lisa, I'm going to start with you, just a little bit about it, about why you love the institution, maybe point to one or two things that are in the collection that you really get excited telling people about. And then Patrick, I'll come to you with the same question.
Sure. Well, compared to APS, we are a brand new institution. We are coming up on our 80th birthday. The library was established by virtue of a bequest made by Herbert and Linda Hall, who were two wealthy and very philanthropic Kansas Cityans. And the library was a great expression of civic philanthropy on their part. They were childless and wanted to leave something behind after their deaths. And they left their estate, which was 20 acres, and their home, as well as an endowment to create a library for the people of Kansas City, Missouri. However, by the time they died, there was a public library. And so the Board of Trustees decided that this library ought to be devoted to science, engineering, and technology to spur commercial interest and investment in the area. And as a result, 80 years later, Kansas City is a hub for major engineering firms and other technology enterprises. So it was very prescient of the first Board of Trustees to do that. So over the years, we have grown. We occupy a footprint of 200,000 square feet. So it's very easy to be socially distant in our building. You can go days without seeing other people. Anyway, the collections also have grown, and they have shifted to mirror the times. We have a history of science collection that begins in 1472 and comes up to mid-20th century, but we are also very much a contemporary library, and we collect contemporary materials having to do with science, engineering, technology. Some of these materials actually circulate. So on one hand, we are a closed stack research library that is very committed to a research mission. On the other hand, we are a circulating collection that is here to serve our local and regional community as they may see fit. We also maintain a very robust public programming presence, and we regard that as the outward expression of our collections. It's the way we make our collections available to people who may not actually have a need for the printed word. And I could go into much greater detail, but I'm sure Patrick wants to talk about his institution as well.
Well, Patrick, let me bring you in. I love hanging with people who are historically minded too, because they say things like, "Oh, we're a very young institution, only 80 years old." Patrick, tell us a little bit about the American Philosophical Society.
Yeah, no, our history is a little longer, but I will try not to speak for too long about the history, because I know there's a lot more that you want to cover, Scott. We were founded by Benjamin Franklin and a group of other civically minded individuals in 1743 with the mission, which is still part of our title, to promote useful knowledge. The American Philosophical Society's full title is the American Philosophical Society, held at Philadelphia for promoting useful knowledge. And we do this in a number of different ways. We elect members in all different disciplines after a distinguished career advancing knowledge. We hold a series of meetings and conferences in which people come here to Philadelphia to share the latest cutting edge research in all different fields. And of course, that's now turning more and more virtual in the midst of 2020 and 2021. We also have a publications program, one of the longest continuously operating presses in North America. And we also provide over $1 million of research grants every year, about $1.2 million, in fact. And that's for folks to go out in the field and conduct research, again, in all different fields, but also to come here to the research library to conduct research. And the library itself has over 14 million pages of manuscripts and over 300,000 bound volumes. It dates to that very early period when early members were trying to collect a science library that others could learn from. And it's continuing to grow. We now have the collections of 7 Nobel laureates, collections that relate to over 650 different Native communities, and an incredible collection documenting the early national period of the United States. And you asked about some of our favorite items in that collection, and I thought I might mention a few that relate, I think, in some ways to the moment we're living in. The first is, Franklin was somebody who was at first suspicious of inoculation, but then as he learned more and studied the data, his opinion changed and became one of the great advocates for the inoculation in smallpox. And in fact, he lost his son to smallpox, not because he was opposed to it, but because he couldn't get his son the vaccination in time. But that really was a transformative experience where he became an advocate for inoculation. We have this incredible letter from George Washington writing in the midst of the American Revolution, giving orders to inoculate the troops, which proved to be a decisive decision in helping the American cause defeat the British. This was in the midst of a smallpox epidemic, and he was able to inoculate his troops to defend them against that hidden enemy. And then most recently, our Nobel laureate, Barry Blumberg, identified the hepatitis B vaccine. We have his papers, over 700 linear feet, and that discovery led to a vaccine that has saved millions of lives. So when I've been thinking about the pandemic in our collection, there's so much of this history that's embedded in our holdings.
Thank you both for sharing. Your enthusiasm really comes through, both of you, listening to you talk about these. And as a historian, I could really sort of listen to you talk about all these collections all day long and be perfectly content, partially because I haven't been in an archive in so long. And I'm really desperate to get into one. And I guess with that, and I know you hear from researchers all the time who are probably pestering you as I'm about to, when can we get back into the physical space? But let's roll it back a little bit. Lisa, let me start with you to late winter, early spring. COVID-19 is a distant thing, and then within a very short period of time, it's not. Walk us through the decision-making process as you were starting to cope with that early on in the pandemic.
Quite honestly, the decisions were foisted upon us. And when you talk about a short amount of time, I'm talking about 6 hours. Because I believe the mayor of Kansas City, Missouri, ordered a shutdown. I can't remember the exact date, but it was maybe Friday. If Friday may have been March 19th. I can't even remember at this point. But anyway, that morning I had a meeting of my senior staff, and I said, this COVID thing, I just have this feeling we may have to shut down on fairly short notice, and I think you ought to begin assembling some work from home projects for your staffs. And that was it. Now, I had a series of meetings all day in one room, which is not a SCIF, but it may just as well be. There's very bad Wi-Fi transmission, and I was in this conference room all day having a series of meetings, got out about 3:00, and my chief financial officer said to me, the Nelson Atkins Museum just made the decision to shut down. And the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art is the biggest museum in Kansas City. And so if the big dog goes down, it's like all the dominoes were going to fall right after that. And I said, why? And she said, well, the mayor of Kansas City is going to order probably on Monday a citywide shutdown. Well, between 3:30 and 5:00 that afternoon, every single museum and library in Kansas City announced that as of 5:00 that day, they were closed to the public for the foreseeable future. So when I say a period of about 6 hours, I meant it. And I called my staff back in on Monday and Tuesday of the following week because we needed to make plans. People had to be sent home with equipment. Not everybody had a laptop. Not everybody had, stuff that they could travel with. So we had to figure out who needs what, who needed a mobile hotspot because they didn't have internet connection where they live. And we had to get all of that figured out in a very brief amount of time and just send people home. And that happened in a period of about a day and a half. And by Tuesday noon or so, I was standing on the loading dock waving goodbye to the last staff member to pull away from the library. And from that moment until mid-July, we were the Linda Hall Library in exile. We kept the work of the library going. We had an opportunity to tend to projects that had been long backburnered that could be done in a virtual environment. So our attitude going into this was, let's not let a crisis go to waste. Let's pull something good out of this. And we pulled a lot of good out of a very big misfortune. And I mean, I can talk later if you'd like me to about everything we did to keep safe, because I'm very proud of the fact that with the exception of one person who got sick over the holidays, nobody else has gotten sick. We have had a completely COVID-free staff, and we're working hard to maintain that. So we pulled a lot of good out of adversity, and I'm proud of my staff for doing that. But it just whipped everybody's heads around. We all felt really whipsawed by it, and it took a toll on all of us, I think.
Well, I'm happy to hear that you've only had one staff member that's been sick. And just to go back to that moment, I mean, that's a remarkable story. I mean, such a short period of time to close down. And did you think, because I remember at Drexel, I mean, the idea was, well, we're gonna close down, but it was so open-ended at the beginning. And you'd have these conversations and people say, well, we'll be back in 2 weeks. And then you had people like me who was saying, no, we'll be back in the fall of 2021. Nobody wanted to hear that. But what were you thinking at that time in terms of return?
The mayor did issue a shutdown. I believe it was through April. And as the weeks ticked on, I privately thought, no, we're not going to be back in April, maybe the end of May. And we got to the end of May and I thought, maybe not. And the city started to open up slowly. But all of the cultural institutions were on their own timeline, and some of them opened up in late May as the city was opening up. We reserved the right to have a phased return, so we took a bit longer. And one of the reasons we could do that is we are a free library. Nobody has to pay a dime to get into the Linda Hall Library, whereas most of the most of the museums in Kansas City depend upon paid admissions for an important revenue stream. And so they were under a great deal of pressure to begin to reopen, to recapture as much lost revenue as they can, or as they could. We did not have that pressure, so we could drag it out a little bit more. And I started to tell my staff, maybe, just maybe by the end of June, we can think about going back. But we also had the luxury of time to plan, to phase in all of our safety precautions, and to make sure people had achieved an appropriate level of comfort. I didn't want anybody to think that they were in danger of getting sick because they came to work.
Patrick, let me bring you in on this. Kind of the same question, just in terms of when COVID entered your consciousness and how you started thinking about what the shutdown was going to look like.
Yeah, I'm actually hearing Lisa's reminisce, very similar experience, especially in terms of, what we've been able to accomplish in spite of it all, and the way that we've been able to, in many ways, serve our collections remotely and make things more accessible, both remotely, but also when we are able to reopen. I think our collections are going to be in a better condition than they ever had been before. But hearing, Lisa talk and your comments, Scott, the most challenging thing for me, at least, has been thinking ahead. Making decisions about the future. The decision to close was, as Lisa said, it was March 13th, a Friday, and everybody else was closing, and there were all these orders to close, and you knew you were closing. But when you're trying to make long-term plans and decisions, that has been the biggest challenge, I think, for us. We try to hold in-person conferences. We need to plan for those. Those take a year of planning before you can even hold them. So when we start thinking about, the fall of 2021 or the spring of 2022, what are people's appetites going to be? Do we want to start investing resources to hold conferences? Do we want to start having people go through this, all the effort to reopen, only to realize we've done all this effort and we can't reopen because we aren't open right now? So, the decision making and long-term planning has been, I think, the biggest challenge after closing for me, at least.
Just want to remind folks that you're listening to COVID Calls, and we're having a special conversation in partnership with the Linda Hall Library and the American Philosophical Society. And I want to remind folks, you can get questions in today for Patrick Spero and Lisa Brower. If you're watching on YouTube, you can just put them in the YouTube live chat and we get them that way, or you can put your question up on Twitter. Just be sure to tag me at US of Disaster and we'll get those questions in. Something you both said, which I want to kind of shift and talk a little bit about now, is how you adapt your model of serving, your patrons. And speaking from the perspective of a researcher, you're planning a book or even writing an article. Sometimes we'll make a visit to a research library because we want to go in and see what's there, or we want to see if there's some museum, pieces there or something like that. But a lot of times there's a lot of planning that goes in. And if we've got a book, we might have a schedule planned pretty tight, a couple of weeks at Linda Hall Library, few weeks at American Philosophical Society, for those who have busy research and teaching schedules and home lives, it can get a little hectic. And now all of a sudden, the researcher can't get into the archive. So that's just one of many things that I know both of you have had to think about in terms of patron services. So let's talk about that a little bit. Patrick, let me bring you in on this first. Some of the adaptations that you can tell us about how you've met researcher needs at this time. And then Lisa, I want to ask you about that as well.
Sure.
Yeah, no, and once we shut down, people that work in research libraries know how important our work is. We are not just the stewards of the past, our shared past, but we're also active sites of research. I like to say, whenever everyone was talking about all the laboratories that were shut down in the sciences because of the closure, research libraries are really the laboratories for the humanities. You might walk into our reading room and it looks like people are just sitting there reading old documents, but what they're actually doing is making discoveries, and those discoveries they share with the rest of the world. And so when we shut down, those discoveries were no longer happening in the way that they used to. And in some ways, just like a graduate student in the sciences has to have lab work in order to complete their doctorate, so many students and scholars and researchers really depended on access to our materials to advance in their career and in their lives. And so our shutdown, we realized, had a major impact on a lot of folks who had been really relying and expected to rely on our collections. So of course, we tried to switch as much as we could to a virtual environment. We increased the amount of reference we provided. We increased the amount that we digitize. We now have over 250,000 images digitized in our digital library. And if you were to look at our graph, it's gone up dramatically after the shutdown, precisely because we were trying to invest in more collections. We had a fundraising drive that was very successful in order to do expanded digitization work. And we're now looking at remote fellowships. Fellowships are one of the key ways to have scholars access our material. These provide funds for scholars who might need the resources to travel and spend a month in a foreign city. They haven't been able to do that. So now we're trying to turn these into virtual fellowships in which we're able to digitize the collections they need and also try and involve them in the greater intellectual life around our library. So really, a lot of it has been moving to digitization and increasing access that way for us.
Well, just that last part you're saying, just so I'm clear. So, there's digitization and researchers are used to that and they hope that the collections that they want to use are being brought online. But you're actually describing something a little more different there with a fellowship, with a fellow who might find certain materials they want to use and your staff is going to take the step of making them available.
Yeah, no, it's kind of digitization on demand. We had done that. We had done remote reference before, but there's been a dramatic spike. We had to allocate more resources towards that. And then this remote fellowship would be an entirely different type of fellowship. What I'm personally interested in, we're trying to figure out how to make that work. A fellow receives, say, $3,000 for a month. Now they can reallocate that towards digitization. And what my big question is, and time will tell, is whether or not we're able to digitize more with $3,000 than they would be able to do in person for 35 hours a week for 4 weeks. There's so much you would lose by not coming in person, but I just wonder in a sheer amount of material you can get if they're able to get more material by paying for digitization.
Lisa, bring you in. Same question, and anything that Patrick said too that you wanted to address. Let's talk about it.
Sure. I'll get back to the virtual fellowships in a moment, but one of the things I neglected to mention was at the moment we shut down, we were less than a month into implementing our first year of a 3-year strategic plan, the purpose of which is to bring more people into the building, either through research or through our public programming effort. So that was another thing that we quickly had to recalibrate, and our public programming was almost instantaneously moved onto a virtual platform where it enjoyed unprecedented success. And I think that virtual programming will be in our future, even when we're back into the building. We are in the building now, but when we can welcome the public back into the building in large numbers, we will still be doing some form of virtual programming. So there's that one thing. I will say that the Linda Hall Library has always had a history of providing material virtually to a lot of scholars because, we're in the middle of the map and some people have an easier time getting to us than others. So we'd been in the business of providing digital materials to people for a long time. When we shut down, I think we had a few fellows in residence, and we said, we're sorry, but we're closing and we'll be in touch. And we helped them through the balance of their fellowship with, as much free digitization as they needed. We also gave them the opportunity to put a pause in their fellowship and perhaps come back to finish it when it was safe to do that, if their research schedule would accommodate that. We still have some obligations to outstanding fellows, and some are coming to do research here in a very well-planned manner. But some have opted to convert their trip here into a virtual fellowship. And because we were having so much success with that, we pulled the trigger on the decision fairly quickly that for the round to come, we've just closed applications for that round, 100% virtual. And I think, Patrick, you raised a good point about how much will $3,000 buy in terms of digital production. I think we're all eager to see how that question gets answered. This will be an experiment for us to see how 100% virtual fellowship opportunity goes, but part of our strategic plan is to experiment and modify our successes and amplify our successes, and things that were less successful, see how we can fix them and make them better. So I would say that, life changed for us in the way that we provide service to our readers, but not the quality of service and not the amount of service. I think we are still providing the same high quality service that we can to the people who use the library. The one thing I will say that I find really disappointing is that the one thing you lose in virtual scholarship is the serendipitous discovery. Winding up in the reading room with another scholar who may be working on something that is sort of kind of almost like your project, and what you discover about each other over a cup of coffee. That part is lost, and I lament that, and I hope that we can return to that sometime soon. So that's kind of where we are.
That's what I was going to follow up with both of you on this. I mean, the idea of the digital fellowship is an important adaptation for these times. At the same time, like you said, Lisa, I mean, a lot of research in any field can be solitary, but we also know the walk to the lunch place, the walk back from coffee, the relationships that develop between archivists, librarians, and researchers, it's a real relationship there. And people who maybe don't know as much about how historical research works. I mean, historians often come into an archive and they're like, okay, what do I do? And you're relying on the experts who know the materials and who know things that you don't know about. What are some of the ways, as you begin to think about how to manage that kind of relationship building, that you're thinking you can accomplish remotely? Lisa, let me ask you that first, and then Patrick, because we can't do everything remotely, but maybe we can do more than we thought we could 10 months ago.
I think we've surprised ourselves in that respect, Scott. I've certainly, Ben Gross, who's the head of our fellowship program, has been very enterprising and experimental, and that he periodically has Zoom coffee breaks with past and current fellows. As I told somebody not long ago, that even if you have been a fellow anytime in the past 10 years, you never quite escape our clutches. We try to keep in touch with you, and we're building up an alumni population. So everyone who wishes to join in these coffee breaks is certainly welcome. And I think that has helped knit together a closeness and a sense of camaraderie, and a sense that even though we may be working in isolation in our own homes or offices, there are other people out there doing the same thing. We also have, and we had this prior to the shutdown, a works in progress seminar that met once a month, and it was open not only to fellows in residence, but any scholar in the greater metropolitan region who wanted to come and join in. And it was an opportunity for them to share a chapter, an article, something in progress with a group of people who could give them feedback and criticism. And that, again, helped foster not only a sense of camaraderie, but helped us build something of an intellectual community both within and around the library where none used to exist. So I think that we have been able to transfer that activity into the virtual space. It's not exactly the same, but it's not a bad substitute.
Patrick, we've been talking about the impact on the researcher, and you can address that if you like, but I also like to hear a little bit about the impact on the staff and what's it been like for staff to cope with this really pretty big change in how they work, and with an extra question added on about conservation staff, because when I think about a place like APS, I think about, as you said, materials that go back 300 plus years. That stuff can't just sit around. Much of it's being repaired at any given time. Can you talk to those issues a little bit?
Yeah, I can. And actually, I've been thinking about our conversation about the digital fellowships and what it may mean. And I think your question is related to a thought that I've been trying to sort out in my head, and maybe both of you can help me do that. Let's just imagine the future. And let's just say that digital fellowships, it turns out that for $3,000, you can see way more material than you ever could have seen in person. And it makes a lot of sense to do those. At the same time, Scott, I spent a lot of time in research libraries, working on my books, and I know exactly how important it is to have that intellectual community. But, and so that is a key part of what a research library is. It's where ideas are exchanged. But the access to the material, our job as librarians, as stewards of these collections, are to preserve them, not just provide access, but also preserve. And there's actually a tension in those two, because when you provide access, you're putting these materials at risk. So if it is, makes more sense to digitize on demand rather than call a 18th century letter that somebody can touch, I mean, is that a acceptable outcome? And what does that mean for the future of the reading room? If we find that that's, makes a lot more financial sense. I know that didn't answer your question, Scott, but that's a thought that has come to mind hearing this conversation. Not to say that we can't have people still exchange ideas over brown bags, over tables. We might even have more space for that. But, is digitization on demand an acceptable outcome? Do you have to see the stuff to do the work?
Patrick, what you're both saying is really resonating with a lot of conversations I've had with other scholars about this whole issue about rethinking the humanities more generally and the way we do things. And we like to think that we're always looking for best practices, but often it does take a shock to take a good hard look at the sort of ideas that we march into research with. For history, for example, that it should be solitary and that you should make a pilgrimage to an archive. And if you don't do that, then you somehow haven't completed the mission of doing the research. And I don't want to put that aside because that's the world I grew up in. At the same time, you're both describing adaptations to the reality of the world we live in, which may also have broader implications for scholars who are working in the global South who can't get to Philadelphia or Kansas City, or for scholars who haven't had access, can't take time off work. Maybe they're not full-time historians or researchers. This opens up a lot of space to talk about access more generally. And maybe those conversations we weren't having those in such a robust way before the pandemic. That's not even a question. It's just me rambling out my thoughts. But I've enjoyed, hearing you both sort of think, and you're both experimenting in real time with this. Lisa, anything to that?
Well, I'm thinking back to a conference that was at APS a couple of years ago that I participated in, and Pat, a lot of the issues that you just mentioned about digital versus genuine article, I recall being discussed then. And I can't remember if this was in a session or a side conversation, but I got into a conversation with somebody about what is the genuine artifact. And the person I was speaking with was of a different generation than I am, a younger generation. And I kept arguing that, the digital copy was a copy. It was one generation removed from the original. And he kept trying to convince me that the digital object was an original object in and of itself, even though it was derived from something else. And I wasn't really quite buying it, but I can see his point. And I think that, if we want to have these kinds of philosophical conversations, we're approaching a point in time where they may be very relevant, to our actual work rather than just interesting mind exercises.
I want to shift gears a little bit here, if it's okay. One of the features of the pandemic that we should have seen, that I should have seen coming, many of us should have seen coming, it was the degree to which conspiracy thinking would enter, disinformation, and it really underlines to me the importance of the stewards of knowledge. And that doesn't mean we all have to agree on one set of facts. That's not the point of a research archive or a library. It's to facilitate critical thinking and deep engagement with the past as we think about the future. And so I wonder if I could hear from both of you about what it's been like to be in your role, basically as a person who runs an institution that's committed to advancing knowledge and seeing these kind of daily assaults on really life-saving knowledge around the pandemic. Patrick, can I ask you about that first?
Sure. A few things come to mind. The American Philosophical Society has not issued a lot of statements in its history, certainly not in its recent history. But the Council of the Society was so moved by the moment, realizing the way in which bad information, false information, disinformation was affecting the reaction that Americans globally had to the pandemic, but Americans in particular. And so in the spring, issued the first public statement that it's done in decades, basically calling on a re-energized and increased funding for education, precisely because it is so important that facts get out there, that science and knowledge are accepted, are believed, and people have the ability to suss out good information from bad. And that was a really dramatic act for the society. And I think really was this moment is what really energized people to make that statement. Though I think many of them believed it for years already, seeing the changes in the culture. This is a manifestation of years of this building up. The other thing is, and Scott, Lisa, I'd love to hear what you think about this. It's something that I have struggled to wrap my head around, and that's that we have an incredible collection of the history of science going back to Newton, who of course nobody's questioned gravity, but most people dismiss alchemy today. So there is science that has persisted in bad science, what people call pseudoscience, and I can tell you that what we might call pseudoscience is embedded in our collections as well. And what do we do with pseudoscience? If the society were to mount an exhibition on pseudoscience from Newton to the present, would that undermine science? And yet it is such an important element to understanding how knowledge is developed and changed over time. And it's something that I don't know what to do with. We talk about it a lot, but we haven't done anything with it.
Lisa, let me throw that over to you. I mean, what an interesting provocation to not only sort of tackle disinformation in the now, but to also treat that as a historical problem as it's embedded within the archive. It's a fascinating idea.
Well, truly, and we certainly have our share of holdings devoted to alchemy. But our starting point is, to quote the late, great Daniel Patrick Moynihan, everybody's entitled to their own opinion, but not to their own facts. And we mostly we completely deal in science fact. And, one example of that is Darwin and his theory of evolution. And there are people among our supporters at the library who would refrain from coming to any program that we held having anything to do with Darwin or evolution because they believed in intelligent design and creationism. And that's fine. They're entitled to it, but we will not be doing any programs about that because we deal in science, the accepted science. And after the most previous president took office 4 years ago and seemed to discredit science with great abandon, a lot of people expressed concern to us, and we actually had a public town hall meeting about this. What's the Linda Hall Library going to do? Are you going to feel repressed about collecting science? And, what about the government and what are they collecting? And there was a great deal of anxiety about this. And all we could do was to tell them and reassure people that our commitment to collecting science, proven science that could be backed up, was solid. It would remain solid into the future, and that we will preserve this information. We will not purge our collections. We will not change our collecting policy, we will continue to collect this and not collect disinformation unless it served some scholarly purpose to do so. But we would not collect disinformation in place of collecting. I hate to say proven, settled science because I don't know that it ever is. I mean, I'm getting into kind of squishy territory here. But we've been dealing with this anxiety for far longer than the recent pandemic.
Well, let's stay with this. And Lisa, let me just bring this back to you for a second, because this is kind of the challenge of this too, is the collecting in the now. I mean, research archives are tending to the past, but you're also thinking, I mean, everybody's trying to think, what do we need in the archive of this pandemic? And there's a lot of things in there that might not meet that test, Lisa, and I like that test about facts and that commitment and not bending to pressure and concern about the government. But those disinformation moments and the pandemic and conspiracy and all that, that's part of the archive of the now too, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And one of our reference librarians I mean, we didn't ask her to do this, but she volunteered to do it. She maintains a research guide, which is readily available on our website, that is really documenting the COVID experience in Kansas City. Now, it's mostly devoted to where you can go to find information about getting tested, getting the vaccine, infection rates and all of that. But it's become a little bit more comprehensive than that. So that is pretty much the way we're documenting the pandemic. I think some of the local history collections, the Western Missouri Historical Collection, is doing a much more comprehensive job of documenting the experience citywide.
Patrick, same question to you. What are the efforts that you have underway to begin an archive of this time? And you gave a little bit of a clue earlier when you were talking about some of the pieces in the APS collection that were resonant of vaccine disputes from the 18th century, for example. So you already have maybe a basis for that conversation, but how are you and your staff thinking about the archive of this time?
Yeah, so I would say our collection has a lot of material from scientists, from doctors, and so my goal would be to, in 20, 30 years, be able to recruit the papers of some of the scientists who are on the front lines today, whether they were contributing to public policy, whether they're contributing to vaccine and experimentation. That is where I would see our collecting going. So in some ways, we're not really equipped, and our strength is not in collecting, say, there are a lot of places out there that are collecting all the, what we would call ephemera, maybe there's a series of tweets, maybe there's web announcements, they're archiving those, and those need to be archived. That's not our strong suit. And one of the things as an archive is you have to understand where your strengths are and build upon them. So I see, we have to be mindful of this moment and realize that, right now we can't get the papers of scientists who are actively working in the field, but to be aware of who's out there and to hope in 20 or 30 years that the strength of our current collection will attract those papers to ours.
I want to, there's a question that's come in. We've had a couple of comments and questions and lively conversation going on Twitter. Cheryl Knott is asking about finding aids being important. This comes back to some of the points we were talking about earlier. I don't know if either one of you want to take on this question. She's wondering if you're experimenting with or rethinking how to make finding aids as informative and accessible as possible.
That's been one of our biggest investments in remote work. Our head of manuscripts processing, someone named Val Lutz, was able to digitize all of the handwritten or typewritten guides, indexes to our manuscript collections, many of which were not yet on the website, but were in the boxes. So if you call the box, you get all the information you really need. Now we're able to, our archivists are taking those and turning them into finding aids, almost item level finding aids. And more generally, one of the really interesting things about research libraries, separate from the pandemic, is what I see is the shifting role of finding aids in terms of research. Sometimes our finding aid might contain a biographical note of a scientist, and it might be the most thorough and researched, biographical background note on the scientist out there, more than anything that had been printed before. This is something that's been working in the 1980s or 1990s. And that archivist has done the most research in this person's work. And we're increasingly finding our finding aids are being cited as sources in people's work, which I think is great. But it also raises the question to us about how we archive our own material, because if somebody cites a finding aid as it is in 2021, and then somebody edits it in 5 or 6 years, we want to be able to preserve that change in some ways.
Thanks for that question, Cheryl. We have a few minutes left. There's another issue I just wanted to circle back, and maybe we can, if there's any other thoughts that you have about it. Lisa, I wanted to ask you about this, just about the staff, your staff, and you've talked throughout this conversation about communication and closing in 6 hours and the tension and the stress. I'd like to just hear a little bit more about that. I think about that a lot in the higher ed environment and my, the faculty in the department where I was at Drexel. And, a lot of times people are, if we are working remotely, we don't get that water cooler conversation. And so it's harder to check in on people and know how they're doing. As a leader of an institution like Linda Hall, how have you approached that?
It's been a process, and we've had a number of all staff meetings, even now that we're all back in the building. I mean, for all intents and purposes, we're back. We're open for public service on a limited basis. So we're back. But we are still doing all of our staff meetings via Zoom, even if we're next door to each other. We try not to inhabit the same spaces if we can possibly manage otherwise. But during the months of closure, we had a lot of all staff meetings that were on Zoom. Seemed to, not a replacement for the real thing, but seemed to be better than nothing. And I know that I was in a lot more frequent contact with a lot of staff members that I'm not necessarily in frequent contact with, just to reassure them and let them know that they are on my mind. I am thinking about them, and that we were using the time to plan for our return in a safe manner, and that I would not let anybody back into the building unless I was convinced that it was 100% safe for them to come back. And during the time we were shut down, our air filtration system was upgraded to hospital quality air filters, and we laid in supplies of personal protective equipment, whether some people needed it or not. And anything anybody wanted to make them feel safe and comfortable, we provided for them. So a lot of my time was trying to bolster people's spirits and to make them feel secure enough that I would not ask them to do anything I was unwilling to do myself. And I think that that investment of my time in their welfare paid off big time. I think it made us actually stronger as a staff.
Patrick, I'd like to hear some of the same, issues, how you've addressed those.
It was a very similar situation in which, we needed to make and assure staff that we were taking all the precautions necessary. It required a lot of shifting of offices to give people the space that they wanted. A lot of investment in, as Lisa said, we invested in an entirely new HVAC system, greater filtration. All these changes that I think are good things, and our staff are very comfortable coming back. We've had to close back down, but for that moment, people felt really, really, really comfortable, and that was important. But then I was thinking again to Scott's comment about the need for fellows to be in person. I also think about all the things that the serendipity that staff experienced by working in the same building, because we're split up by departments. We're split up by where we work and who we report to and our supervisors. So there's so much serendipity that happens in the hallways. It happens at the lunch table. So, if you're in the processing department, you learn about what the catalogers are doing or what the conservation department's doing. And that type of stuff that just happens in the course of business has really gone away. And one of the things, we've learned so much about how we can work remotely and be productive remotely, but there is still so much that you, as a staff, as an organization, that you get by being in person. I can't wait to have my office open again so we can have a social hour in my office with all the staff, again, just talking. We can't do that on Zoom. We've tried, and it's okay, but it's just not the same. And so I'm really looking forward to having that serendipity come back into the office place.
Just want to remind everybody you've been listening to COVID Calls, and you can catch COVID Calls live every weekday at 5 p.m. Eastern Time, except for tomorrow when you catch COVID Calls at 4 p.m. Eastern Time for the second of our conversations in partnership with the American Philosophical Society and Linda Hall library, please do join me for that. And the topic tomorrow is biomedicine in the archives, and we'll be talking with two really extraordinary researchers and scholars, Joanna Radin and Robin Wolf Scheffler. So please do join us tomorrow for that at 4 o'clock. And I just want to take this moment to thank Lisa Brower and Patrick Spiro. I know how hard you think about these issues and wanting to serve researchers and your own staff, and it's really impressive, frankly, to have this opportunity to be with you and hear it from you in person. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Scott.
Stay healthy, everybody. We'll see you tomorrow, 4 o'clock.